What happens to a mind that learns from the very beginning that truth is optional and love is conditional? In the case of Ted Bundy, this question isn't rhetorical, it's foundational. Before he became the name whispered with horror across decades, before the courtrooms, the escape attempts, or the dozens of murdered young women, there was a boy. A boy who grew up in a house where his grandfather was violent, where his mother was introduced to him as his sister, and where the identity of his real father was buried under shame. Bundy's life did not begin with blood. It began with confusion, fragmentation, and secrets. Ted Bundy would later be known as one of the most terrifying serial killers in American history. Charming, educated, articulate, and beneath it all, profoundly disconnected from the humanity of others. He lured women with a fake injury, then murdered them with brutality that suggested not just hatred, but a need to dominate, erase, possess. He confessed to over 30 murders, but the real number may never be known. More chilling than the acts themselves was the calm with which he described them, the absence of remorse, and the eerie sense that each murder was a means to restore something broken inside. Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? Stay with me. The truths we are about to uncover go deeper than you might expect. Because to understand Ted Bundy is not to excuse him. It is to explore how darkness takes shape when identity is fractured at the root. Let's begin where this story truly starts. Not with crime, but with a childhood cloaked in lies. He was born into a narrative already twisted, not simply by circumstance, but by intentional concealment. His birth certificate named a false father. His mother, afraid of societal judgment, posed as his sister. And the man who took the role of patriarch in his early life, his grandfather, was known to be volatile, cruel, and by some accounts, deeply disturbed. In this fragmented household, Bundy absorbed conflicting models of masculinity, control as power, silence as safety, and charm as camouflage. This wasn't just dysfunction, it was a psychological blueprint, quietly etching itself into the fabric of his developing identity. Understanding a mind like Bundy's doesn't bring comfort. It doesn't offer redemption, but it forces us to confront the uncomfortable. That monstrosity often begins not in explosions of violence, but in quiet rooms with hidden truths and emotional abandonment. The boy who would later be called a monster was, for a time, just a child, one who learned early that survival sometimes means becoming whatever others expect, even if that means severing the self in the process. Have you ever recognized fragments of these patterns in ordinary people? Share your perception. Your voice matters here. And before we go further, check if you're already subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This space exists for those who seek to understand, not to simplify. And if that's your path too, we'd be honored to have you with us. Here, we don't excuse. We don't glorify. We examine, piece by piece, what happens when identity fractures and no one is there to hold the pieces together. Because before Bundy became a killer, he became a question that leads us next into the construction of his social mask, the polished exterior that deceived even those closest to him. He stepped into adulthood cloaked in the illusion of potential. Ted Bundy, psychology student, aspiring lawyer, volunteer in political campaigns, crafted an identity that spoke of promise, intelligence, and charm. He knew how to dress, how to speak, how to offer help with just the right amount of confidence. On the surface, he was the kind of man people wanted to believe in. But underneath, there was no search for connection, only strategy. Every smile, every gesture, every word was calibrated. The world saw charisma. He saw tools. During his 1979 trial, Bundy chose to represent himself, not out of legal necessity, but psychological compulsion. He faced the jury with controlled posture, held his gaze with eerie steadiness, and smiled as though he were delivering a lecture, not defending against charges of murder. At one point he declared, "I'm not guilty of murder, and I'll stand on that to the end." It wasn't just denial, it was performance. a final act in the theater of deception he'd been perfecting for years. Bundy's transformation into a socially admired figure didn't happen by chance. Former classmates described him as intense but brilliant, while others noted a cold, calculated demeanor that surfaced when he wasn't being watched. One former girlfriend recalled that he often mimicked emotions, as if testing which reactions earned trust, affection, or control. Behind his words was always a deeper agenda. He didn't connect, he mirrored. But there's another hidden layer we need to uncover. Was Bundy's charm a learned defense against emotional instability, or the sharpened blade of manipulation? The answer lies not in what he said, but in how closely he studied the effect of every word. But there's another hidden layer we need to uncover, one that doesn't begin with violence, but with rejection. Long before the first confirmed murder, there was a moment that seems to echo through the psychology of Ted Bundy with disturbing weight. The abrupt breakup with Stephanie Brooks, a woman he had idealized, pursued, and molded himself around. She represented success, beauty, social standing, everything Bundy wanted to possess and perhaps more importantly to become. When she ended the relationship, citing his lack of ambition and direction, something fractured. For a man whose identity was a fragile construction, the rejection wasn't just personal. Years later, after reinventing himself with academic achievements, political ties, and social polish, Bundy reconnected with Stephanie under false pretenses, only to abruptly disappear from her life after she fell for him again. This reversal wasn't about closure. It was theater control, a mirrored retaliation. Her rejection had created a void he never filled, but it also sparked a transformation, one where the desire to reclaim control began to bleed into darker impulses. Many of Bundy's known victims shared physical similarities with Stephanie. Long dark hair, parted in the middle, youthful features. It's a detail that prosecutors highlighted, not as coincidence, but as pattern, an unconscious or deliberate reenactment of symbolic vengeance. His crimes, then, weren't purely opportunistic. They carried an echo, a residue of that early emotional wound. And in the narcissistic architecture of his mind, each act may have served as a grotesque affirmation of power over the rejection he never psychologically digested. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here. What if these murders weren't only expressions of desire or rage, but of narrative control? If this reflection resonates with you, write below. The mind hides more than we dare to see. Now let's go even deeper into this, into the architecture of a mind that didn't simply want to kill, but to dominate. Ted Bundy's crimes were not marked by frenzy, but by method. His calculated use of charm, the fake cast, the appeals for help, the trusting smile, were all parts of a performance staged not only to lure victims, but to prove something to himself. This wasn't about impulse. It was about superiority. Control wasn't a means to an end. It was the end itself. Forensic psychologist Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who interviewed Bundy in the final months before his execution, described him as a man with an icy detachment from his actions. He didn't express guilt. He didn't even seem emotionally affected by the memory of what he had done. When asked directly about his crimes, Bundy often deflected or intellectualized, once saying, "I don't feel guilty for anything. I feel sorry for people who feel guilt." That statement wasn't just revealing, it was diagnostic. It illuminated a mental structure devoid of empathy, where remorse was not a burden, but a weakness in others to be exploited. Bundy often positioned himself as intellectually superior. Even during his trials, he cross-examined witnesses, challenged legal procedures, and smiled at journalists as though he were directing the narrative from within the cage. During one of his televised trials, he said, "I'm not going to be railroaded into something I didn't do," despite mounting evidence. This wasn't just denial, it was a refusal to surrender the story of who he was. Even as the facts closed in, he fought to retain authorship of his identity. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here. Behind every action was an unrelenting need to remain in control, not just of others, but of how he was perceived, remembered, feared. But there's another hidden layer we need to uncover, the internal split that defined Ted Bundy's existence. On one side stood the man in a suit, articulate, courteous, even charming. On the other, a compulsive predator driven by a need so dark it seemed to eclipse his carefully constructed identity. This duality wasn't incidental. It was the axis around which his entire life revolved. Former friends and colleagues described him as calm, helpful, even likable. One professor at the University of Utah's law school recalled how Bundy would stay late after class to discuss case law, never suspecting that hours earlier or later that same night, he might be dragging a body into the woods. The transformation from public persona to killer often took place within minutes. On January 15, 1978, just hours after escaping from jail, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In less than 15 minutes, he brutally assaulted 4 women, killing 2. Then he left, walking calmly back into the night. That same week, he was seen in public, composed, smiling, as though nothing had happened. The compartmentalization was total. There was no visible rupture, but inside, the divide between who he performed as and who he was had already collapsed. In a later interview, Bundy said, "We are all capable of doing anything under the right circumstances." The statement may have been manipulative, but it hinted at something deeper. His perception that the line between man and monster wasn't a chasm, but a crack. The complexity of this mind doesn't end here. Was his violence a descent into madness or a surrender to something that had always been waiting beneath the surface? The complexity of Ted Bundy's mind doesn't end with the crimes he committed. It deepens in the layers of control, performance, and identity that persisted even as his fate was sealed. After years of denial, Bundy eventually changed tactics. But this shift wasn't a sign of remorse. It was his final manipulation. As the date of his execution drew near, Bundy began reaching out to law enforcement across the country, offering information about unsolved murders. He didn't give it all at once. Each detail was calculated, offered as leverage to delay his death. "I'll tell you what you want," he told one investigator, "but only when it's worth something to me." For Bundy, confession was never about conscience. It was about maintaining control. This behavior was entirely consistent with the psychiatric portraits that had emerged over years of evaluation. Yet even in the hands of professionals, Bundy defied easy classification. His mental state was a subject of debate, and at times even contradiction among the experts who studied him. Dr. Emmanuel Tanay, a respected forensic psychiatrist, concluded that Bundy exhibited traits of malignant narcissism, a rare and severe personality structure that blends grandiosity, sadism, and antisocial behavior. According to Tanay, Bundy's crimes were driven by a pathological need to assert dominance, dehumanize others, and maintain an inflated sense of self. He didn't just want to kill, Tanay observed. He needed to annihilate others to feel complete. On the other hand, Dr. Dorothy Lewis, who conducted extensive interviews with Bundy near the end of his life, proposed a more fragmented view. She diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and suggested the presence of dissociative identity features rooted in severe early trauma. Lewis believed that Bundy's emotional detachment and compartmentalized violence stemmed from childhood abuse and neurological irregularities, including potential temporal lobe dysfunction. In her view, Bundy was not simply evil, he was psychologically broken in ways that the legal system struggled to define. Despite their differing conclusions, both experts agreed on one point: Bundy's violence was not impulsive. It was intentional, sustained, and psychologically complex. He didn't suffer from psychosis or hallucinations. He knew what he was doing, and he knew it was wrong. Yet he experienced no guilt. That absence of remorse, coupled with his calculated manipulation and shallow affect, led other professionals to classify him within the spectrum of antisocial personality disorder, ASPD. particularly high-functioning psychopathy. In many ways, Bundy embodied traits across diagnostic categories, never fitting neatly into one box, but showing signs of all. This diagnostic ambiguity mirrored Bundy's own efforts to remain undefined. In his final interviews, he offered no emotional insight into his crimes. He spoke clinically, detached, avoiding personal accountability. Instead of naming victims or acknowledging pain, he blamed pornography, cultural decay, and societal influences. "We are all capable of doing anything under the right circumstances," he once said, a chilling attempt to normalize his actions or perhaps to dissolve his identity into the broader fabric of humanity. His final confessions were partial and selectively true. Some details helped locate long-missing victims. Others were vague or unverifiable, but investigators quickly recognized a pattern. Bundy was stalling. His knowledge became his last weapon, the only thing standing between him and the electric chair. And he wielded it until the very end. Even in prison, Bundy maintained his performance. He changed his tone to match his audience, deferential with psychologists, charismatic with journalists, strategic with detectives. His ego demanded visibility. For someone who had spent his life constructing and controlling how others saw him, fading into obscurity was a fate worse than death. The idea of being executed, erased, and forgotten was unbearable. He needed the last word. Ted Bundy's judicial process began with his arrest in 1978, followed by his first major trial in 1979 for the brutal murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman at the Chi Omega sorority house. Despite overwhelming evidence, including forensic bite mark analysis, Bundy pled not guilty and represented himself, turning the courtroom into another stage. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but a second conviction and death sentence followed for the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Over the next 9 years, Bundy filed appeals, manipulated the media, and attempted to bargain with investigators, delaying his execution at every opportunity. Ultimately, the system closed in, with all legal avenues exhausted and the value of his confessions diminished. Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. Ending a judicial journey that spanned over a decade and revealing perhaps more clearly than ever before the disturbing persistence of a mind built not on madness, but on control. If you've come this far, it means you value the kind of exploration that doesn't settle for surface-level answers. And neither do we. Criminal Psychology Unmasked exists for those who understand that behind every crime lies a mind shaped by layers of identity, experience, and distortion. If you're drawn to that kind of psychological inquiry, consider subscribing. Each week we go deeper, not to excuse but to expose. Right below, the labyrinth never ends. Your perspective adds depth to this ongoing journey through the most complex corners of human behavior. And if this dive into Bundy's fractured psyche resonated with you, a like helps signal that there's value in taking these subjects seriously, with the care, weight, and analysis they demand. Each criminal mind is unique, but the distortions we find often whisper similar truths. Our next exploration will take us even deeper into the complexity of human darkness. See you in the next episode.